introduce Matthew Russell. Matt Russell is a forest analytics consultant with Arbor Custom Analytics LLC based in Pittsfield, Maine. He helps forestry companies and organizations solve forestry problems by leveraging data to make informed decisions. He specializes in forest carbon assessments, growth and yield modeling, and independent research. Thank you, Matt, for coming.
Thanks, Don. Harvested Wood Products, great presentation by Charlie about kind of putting carbon in context, talking about carbon. Perfect segue into talking deeply about harvested wood products. I'll talk about harvested wood products so you can then harvest some liquid products in the next session. So here's my trail map. We'd like to talk just kind of some background information about talking about harvested wood products and the carbon that they store. And sequester, and we'll talk about those differences as well. I have a couple of case studies I would like to walk through that really put harvested wood products in context. Because when we start talking especially about rates of change and sequestration, we need to be thinking about all the wood that comes from a harvest to be able to say something about what those rates are. And then I'm a very applied person. I like to leave with tools that I can use, so I'll show some tools that you might be able to use for describing carbon and wood products that you can take back to the office and to the field with you. And so with that, we all know harvested wood products store carbon. How they do that is through the wood that they have. About half of all the biomass in wood is carbon. And so that's a really useful thing to know. And not all carbon in wood is treated equally. And so that graph on the right that shows some of the different longevities, or in this case, looking at the half-lives of carbon, basically at what point does half of that biomass of that piece of paper or that stud wood basically decay through time. And so you can see here it's as short as 6 years for a piece of paper. It's as long as 100 years for a single-family home. There is a lot of research that goes into trying to quantify these rates of decay in these various products, and one that really depends a lot on certainly the types of species that we're harvesting. Depends a lot on the kind of forest management activities, what size that wood is before it's brought to mills. And so we really need to have a good handle on what those numbers are in order to understand the longevity of harvested wood across a sector. This is data from every year the U.S. Forest Service works and provides data to the Environmental Protection Agency about how much carbon is stored in our forest, how much we're sequestering, and all that. And one of the great things that I look at always is how much carbon is in harvested wood. And so you can see those values here going back to at least 1990. We currently have in the U.S. about 2,700 million metric tons of carbon out there, and that's about 5% of all the forest carbon stocks, including what's in the forest. And so that's a pretty big number if you think about all the wood that's in the products that we use. We typically talk about carbon that's still in the atmosphere as being products in use or in solid waste disposal sites or landfills. And so those products in use are things like lecterns, things like tables, all the wood that goes into our homes, paper, all of those kinds of things. They gradually transition to landfills when they're no longer in service, no longer in use, but that carbon is still in the atmosphere. It hasn't left the atmosphere. It's not being very productive carbon sitting in a landfill slowly decaying through time, but it is still in the atmosphere, so it's important to take note of that. Both of those harvested wood products in use and in wood disposal sites have increased over the time. You know, our economy has grown. We have more people living in the country than we did at least back in 1990, so we're using more forest products generally through time. And so just a tremendous increase in how much wood products we've used across the country. These are some data from the FIA program. If you look at how much we remove from all forests across the Northeast, this is how much, about 800 million cubic feet of wood every year, at least looking at the last cycle of FIA data since about 2014 or so for most of the northeastern states. Not surprisingly, Maine is the clear winner here in terms of largest amount of annual volume harvested. I add New York here. We're talking kind of more about the Northeast, not just New England here. New York follows second, followed by New Hampshire, and then the other states behind that. If you look at both Maine and New York, that represents about 3/4, or about 77% of all total removals from our woods. And this is based on FIA data, basically looking at how much wood is being removed on an annual basis. Now, all that wood is different shapes and sizes, so it can be different in terms of the species composition. That's the graph you see on the left. What are hardwoods being taken out? What about softwoods? And then different sizes, and that's the graph on the right, looking at different pole timber and saw timber removals from the 7 states in the Northeast. And so species and tree size really drive how harvested wood is allocated into different products. And so you can see here, if you look at Connecticut, boy, a lot of hardwood is taken from Connecticut. There is just a small sliver of softwoods taken out of Connecticut. Maine, not surprisingly, has a tremendous spruce fir resource, so Maine kind of leads the way in the total softwood harvest, at least on a proportional basis. And then also, if you look at the graph on the right and look at tree sizes, Maine is also different in that it takes more pole timber. And so the differences here, saw timber for conifers, at least according to the FIA definition, is 7 or 9 inches and above for conifers, or 11 inches and above for a saw timber hardwood. And so pole timber is just everything 5 inches and above. That's not saw timber. And so what you see here is that Maine harvests a lot of that smaller diameter wood. Again, the knowledge that Maine harvests a little bit more intensively relative to the other northeastern states, I think that makes sense, we're seeing that in the FIA data. And then you look at some of the southern New England states, they tend to be harvesting a lot more of a higher proportion of saw timber sized trees, say if you look at Massachusetts and Connecticut relative to the other states. So these kinds of data that we get from FIA are really important in terms of trying to understand how these species and how these different product mixes will eventually result into different longevities for that harvested wood in the atmosphere. Well, I'm a biometrician, and I love flow diagrams and charts like this too. And so this is showing a figure from the U.S. Forest Service showing different pathways for harvested wood and how it can end up into different pools. Generally, we think of all the harvested wood ending up in the 4 pools that you see on top there. And those are products in use and products in solid waste disposal sites like we talked about. But they can also be emitted with energy capture. You're using some of that harvested wood to capture, as a part of energy. Maybe it's boiling, wood going into a boiler, something like that. Or it's emitted without energy capture. It's just left there to decay in that case. And so all of those have different factors when we talk about different forest types and different regions. They're all going to have different rates of decay, different ways that we allocate harvested wood into these 4 different pools. And so from there, they can basically end up in this chain as we begin to recover some of that product, which Caitlin Littlefield talked about this morning and the work that they've done. It's really a kind of an interesting cycle to look at harvested wood as it goes through this process. But the important thing to know is that we basically are going to focus on those 4 boxes in the top there. Working on a project in Minnesota now. This is just example FIA data from 10 example aspen stands in Minnesota. And what you're seeing here is some output that shows how much harvested wood is from these different harvests that occurred. Can't even remember what kind of harvest we did in these stands, but we did something, and we've got some harvested wood that's a part of our output. You see the legend, or sorry, the axis title on the y-axis. Here, I'm talking about the CO2 equivalent. Like Sheila mentioned, really important to understand the units when we're talking about carbon. And so 1 unit of carbon is about 3.7 units of CO2. And so just to point you to that. And I'm going to confuse you even more and use a metric ton and use a per acre basis. So we're kind of dealing with a mix of units here. and that's the metric that a lot of people use in the carbon world. So if you're going to be using carbon in the future, get used to it because you'll continue to see it. So what you see here in the pink is the amount of harvested wood that ends up in products in use immediately after the harvest. That's good. We're immediately taking all that harvested wood and putting it into use into paper, furniture, wherever it's going. But you also lose some from burning it to energy, and then we lose some from other emissions, say through decay. You don't see anything for the landfill here because generally when people do these life cycle analysis analyses, it takes some time for that product to end up in a landfill. So we don't really see any immediate transitions into that landfill. If we look over time, eventually that will all, or most of it will transition to a landfill or be directed and emitted directly to the atmosphere. Why is this important? Well, if we look more broadly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has some guidance. This is kind of at a big country level. How do we take into account harvested wood products? It's certainly harvested wood is a part of our carbon cycle. It's carbon that's being stored in our country. And so there is some guidance kind of from these international protocols about how we account for these. How do we take into consideration the carbon that's being stored in harvested wood? So do know that people are taking this seriously. I'm not going to talk about the carbon programs or carbon markets at all, but I do want to convey and let you know that harvested wood is a part of these carbon programs. And so as one example, the Family Forest Carbon Program, if you look at the methodology that drives that program, this is the Vera VM0045 method. You will see documentation there about how they account for harvested wood products. There used to be this myth that some of these carbon programs didn't take into account the harvested wood that results from something, from a harvest. They do, and this is just one example. If you really dig into the methods behind what's driving many of these carbon programs, you will see some equations embedded in there to account for harvested wood. Well, here's another example. This is the American Carbon Registries, one of their methodologies for improved forest management practice on U.S. forest lands. You can see here, you can dig into their documentation about what you need to know to account for harvested wood products. In this case, it's mostly kind of looking at, okay, how much carbon was harvested that's going to go into those products? How do you account for the mill efficiency, recognizing that not every stick of wood that gets put on a logging truck is going to be ultimately ending up in products in use. There's some wood that gets discarded there. It depends on the mill, how they use all that wood. And then you also need to kind of understand how basically the efficiency of that mill and then how that harvested wood will decay through time. And so just to let you know, don't have to understand all of what goes into this, but most of the methodologies that are being applied across the U.S. now take into account harvested wood products in some way. If you want to do this, and I'll touch on kind of the highlights of these of the literature, but this is the best resource for understanding harvested wood and kind of how we quantify that's really out there. This is a report that Jim Smith and others put together in 2006 that looks at some of the methods. They have great tables in there for some of the forest ecosystem carbon values, which I know have been updated recently by folks at the Forest Service. But in there is some great tables and great resources for harvested wood products. And really for understanding the longevity of harvested wood. So how can we quantify the differences in longevity between a piece of paper and a stud wood that's going to be in the atmosphere for some amount of time. And so these depend on a few things. First of all, it's the product type. We talked about those. Then it's going to depend on the geographic region, recognizing that not every region in the U.S. has paper mills. Not every region in the U.S. has pellet mills. And so it really depends on the geographic region you're at. They try to, in their formulas, to kind of assume certain percentage of the harvest goes into these different products. And so it's important to know that. And you also need to know the general forest type. And these are really the the forest type groups, kind of from the FIA definition of what those are, because there, you're going to have certain amounts of softwood and hardwood. That's going to really depend on what those products are. And then, of course, after they get kind of put into use, they transition to landfills and ultimately to the atmosphere. That wood decays through time, or it's burned, and it kind of results and goes back to the atmosphere. Here's an example. This is some output from that report, and this is really looking at, in the Northeast, our 7 or so different forest types, but the kinds of information that we need to understand how much carbon is stored in this harvested wood. For one example, we need to understand how much of that harvested wood is in hardwood versus softwood. Again, that's going to depend a lot on what those products are. We need to know, well, what about the size of those? Is it saw timber? Is it pulpwood size? We need to know that. We also need to understand how much we need to understand the basics of biomass and carbon. And so really, if you look at the specific gravity of wood, that's going to really allow you to understand how much biomass, how much carbon might be in those different species from those different forest types that we're going to be able to account for. And so at a broad level, need to know these kinds of things using this approach. Here's an example as we're now talking about the different products. And now here are the 7 different products that are outlined in this paper. These are just what happens in the first 15 years after that wood is processed and it's put into use. So you can, as an example, take a look at softwood lumber, that second column. At year 1, it's got, 97% of that piece of lumber is still in use. Now, how do they come up with that 97%? A lot of previous research to kind of come up with that, to try to understand the longevity of that. So there's a lot of information that goes into quantifying this. So if you figure there's 97% of that piece of softwood lumber available at year 1, at year 15, you've got just 70%, or 69.8% of that wood remaining. And so you can see how it's decaying through time. It's either going to a landfill or it's being emitted to the atmosphere. Now you can compare that to the last column all the way on the right. We can look at paper. You can see paper has a much more steep decline when it comes to the longevity. And so here's an example at year 1. We've got about 85% of the paper still remaining. Already in the first year, 15% of that is gone. Pieces of paper decay pretty quickly. If you look at year 15, just 4% of that remains. And so that's kind of 2 widely different longevities in terms of that harvested wood. But we need to understand that in order to understand these different longevities, to understand how long these things are going to be around for. And here's just a visual depiction of that table that I just showed. And so you can see here, take a look at paper, that line in green, boy, that just steeps down pretty quickly, basically flattening out. Pretty much all of that is decayed after 100 years. Compare that to some of the more longer-lived, the more durable wood products, things like OSB, things like softwood lumber, hardwood lumber. Those are going to be the ones that have a longer longevity compared to some of these shorter-lived ones like paper. And then, so we can calculate how much is in use. We know that transitions to landfill. Here's where that's going, and the first 15 years of understanding how much goes to a landfill. The EPA puts out some information every few years on just how much wood is in landfills, and they estimate it's something like 11 or 12 million metric tons of wood that's in landfills. It's a tremendous amount, and as you can expect, that wood is in kind of more of an anaerobic condition. It's not going to decay as fast as it would, say, if it were left in the woods. And so we need to understand the decay rates once it hits a landfill to better understand and to better track the carbon through time. And so we can use tools like from that Smith report to understand how much of that carbon is reduced into a landfill. So then if you put that all together, you might look at something like this. And this is just for all forest types. If we were to simulate and try to understand, okay, I know I'm harvesting a stick of wood, how long is it going to be around for? And so what you see in the purple or bluish color is the products in use, in orange is the landfill, and then in green, it goes back to the atmosphere. And so as an example, you can have a look and see it for some of these products like OSB. OSB is a durable wood product. It stays around for a long time. You can see that a lot of blue there, compared to something like paper where, it's just not staying around very long. So immediately, a lot of that transitions into the atmosphere and not much is around after 100 years. And so this is why it's important to know, as you're conducting forest management scenarios, how it's moving, where is it going in terms of a product. If it's going to some of these more durable products, well, that carbon is going to be around for a lot longer than it is if it was in some of these shorter-lived products. This is kind of a could you imagine graph. And so if you could imagine that if we harvested all the wood in the Northeast, so this is again that kind of 800 million cubic feet of wood we harvest a year across the Northeast, and we were to just let it decay through time, how much wood would be left at, or how long would it take for all that wood to remain? And so if we kind of assume the same product mixes that we've been harvesting at, say, the last 20 years, at least since we've had FIA data, or good quality FIA data, it would be about 13 years for all the wood to reduce in biomass by about half. The half-life would be about 13 years. And so that's a pretty interesting number to compare when we start to look at different scenarios of saying, well, what if we harvested more lower quality material that might be more pulp and paper and say going to wood pellets, compared to if we were to harvest more durable wood products like OSB, like softwood and hardwood lumber. We can begin to make those comparisons if we have good data like this that are presented in that Smith report. A lot of foresters are also interested in, well, what if we just left the wood in the woods and never harvested it? It's going to decay through time. How does that compare to using it to a wood product? I was a part of a project as a part of my postdoc experience that tried to look at some of that in-woods decomposition, and we quantified that for a lot of eastern forest species. And so we have some estimates of, using FIA data, what that might be in terms of how long are they in the woods. So a sugar maple, on average, is in the woods for about 10 years, a white pine about 19 years. Now, it's really hard to understand and to quantify when that piece of wood goes into the soil or decomposes into fine woody debris, but there are ways to do it. If we compare it to the biomass half-life in lumber, well, certainly the wood's going to stay around a lot longer if it's in a durable wood product like lumber than if it was used in, say, pulp or paper. And so the pulp paper, it's around for about 5 years, according to some of the equations that we're using, whereas lumber, it's, decades it's going to survive for. So not to say that, we shouldn't be, we obviously need these small markets, markets that use small diameter wood, because it helps us to improve and to get more of those large saw timber sized trees for those durable wood products. But it's just a kind of interesting comparison to compare if we were to leave things in the woods versus try to harvest them and put them into products. So I'm going to transition a little bit to just a couple of case studies that talk about the importance of understanding carbon as it relates to wood products with forest management. And so this is just one example. This is an oak shelter wood in New York. So we've got oak and pine, northern red oak, eastern white pine. The basal area last year was 188 square feet. In our prescription, we're going to do a shelter wood treatment to 60 square feet, and then we're going to simulate this in FVS to see what comes out on the other end. So here's what comes out. In the table, I'm showing kind of every 10 years how much of that carbon is in the stand, and then how much is in harvested wood products there. And so you can see in the graph on the right, we're looking at the carbon in tons of CO2 equivalent per acre. In blue shows the amount of carbon that's in the stand, and then in orange is everything that's in the harvested wood products. And so this is a shelter wood treatment, so we're going to do two cuts. We're going to do a prep cut in 2033, and you can see immediately we get some carbon that's stored in wood. And then we're going to add some more carbon in that wood pool, in that harvested wood pool, when we do the removal cut in 2043. And so you can see that once we do that, obviously we're reducing the amount of carbon that's in the stand, but we're increasing, at most, in 2043, we've got a lot of carbon in that harvested wood pool, but it decays through time. You can see the orange is getting smaller as that harvested wood products decays basically back into the atmosphere, to landfills, and then to the atmosphere. And that stand carbon is going to recover. And so these are the kind of dynamics that are at play. I like to continue to account for the harvested wood product as long as it's still storing carbon throughout the life cycle of the stand. I think it's important to do that because otherwise, if you only look at what's happening in the stand, you're not really getting the full picture. There's still carbon that came from those woods. And so good to, if you're doing these kind of analyses, take that into account. How much carbon is in the woods, that's typically what we focus on, but also understand how much is in that harvested wood that comes from that forest. A second case study, this goes into a little bit more detail, but this is from the Penobscot Forest. I just pulled out two examples. They have a great long-term research study there, different silvicultural methods. I pulled one of the fixed diameter limit. This was a thin from above, removing every tree greater than 8 inches. What we're going to do here is we're going to harvest that stand in 2053. Again, we're going to simulate this with FBS. We're going to harvest it in 2053 when the volume is about a good amount of volume to harvest, and that's about 2,000 cubic feet. The second example is a selection harvest every 20 years. So this kind of uses single tree and group selection using a Q factor approach with a residual basal area target of about 70 square feet per acre. And so just some example of things here. We can see how the carbon develops through time. We can see what the harvested wood products do through time as well. So here's how the simulations look through 100 years. On the left, we have basal area. On the right is total carbon. Basically, if you know one, you probably have a pretty good idea of the other ones. The shapes of those curves are pretty similar. And so you can see here that there are a couple different stands in each. This is a replicated study, so there are 2 stands within each treatment here. So the fixed diameter limit, we're doing just one harvest, so you see that immediate drop, and then the stand regrowing. The selection harvest, we're doing that every 20 years, so you're seeing the up and down as we continue to harvest. The carbon basically follows the same approach, and so a pretty similar trend there that we see whether we look at stocking or we look at carbon. Like Sheely says, if you know the volume and how that develops in the stand, you probably have a pretty good idea about how the carbon develops through that stand as well. They're all correlated with one another. Here's a graph that's having a look at those forests on the PEF, the fixed diameter limit, how much harvested wood is in use, and then how much are in landfills. And so you can see the graph, the lines in orange show how much carbon is stored in products. And so remember, we're doing just one harvest in the fixed diameter limit. That decreases through time as that harvested wood decays. And what increases is the amount stored in solid waste disposal sites. And so you can see that increase there. The selection harvest, there's a lot more harvesting going on, so you're kind of seeing the ups and downs. Some of it decays, but then more is added. It decays, more is added. So you can kind of see the trend there. But the cumulative amount in landfills continues to increase because we've got a lot of wood that's been in use and now kind of transitioned out of that pool. The important thing to know here, when you calculate something like uptake or sequestration, it's important to understand, well, what do you mean when you say sequestration? I mean, Sheely's point about understanding time 1 and time 2 and the difference over some time period is really important. But are you talking about what's just growing in the woods, or are you talking about what's growing in the woods plus in the harvested wood products? And I encourage you to think about what's also growing or really still continuing to reside in that harvested wood products pool to really have a true accounting of how much harvested wood is there. Really, the only thing that changes is that year when you do a harvest. And so as an example here in the table, you can see in 2053, the amount that is taken out of that forest decreases dramatically, and so you can think about that really changing the rates if you were to just look at that year. But over the long term, you actually have a higher sequestration rate if you include what's also in the harvested wood product pool. And so important when you're seeing, especially when you're seeing people describing some of these harvest rates, understand or ask them if that includes harvested wood products or if they're only talking about what's in the stand. It's important to recognize that. Okay, so I'll end with just talking about a couple of tools. The tool, this is for the power user. I don't recommend everyone go deep into FES, but it is a great tool if you want to do these kinds of things. That is, you have some kind of forest management activity that you want to simulate for the next 100 years or some time period, and you want to know in pretty good detail what's changing, how much carbon is there. You need to have a good tree list, a good forest inventory. You ought to calibrate the model to your local stand conditions using whatever data you have to do so. But it does provide estimates of the disposition in harvested wood through your simulation. So lots of great tables. Pretty much all those graphs that I've shown up to now have been FES output from some of those carbon tables. Really, really valuable. What it really can do, it's not really a life cycle assessment tool. A lot of people try to use it like that, but you cannot in FES input things like how much fuel the skidder used, what the hauling distance was to get the wood from the mill, or from the woods to the mill. It just can't handle that. So it doesn't really do a full life cycle assessment. There are other tools and other people that do those kinds of things. But if you just want to get a sense of how much wood is being harvested, where's it going, FES is a great tool to do that. Another more basic tool, if you don't want to go through all that, I recently worked with Charlie Levesque and the Securing Northeast Forest Carbon Program to develop a web app that kind of does that, utilizing many of those equations that are found in Smith. And so it looks something like this. And so all you need to do, and this is built on using R code with their Shiny server feature, enter some of these basic things about how much timber you harvested from a recent harvest, and it will produce these kinds of graphs for you utilizing those Smith equations. And so a really useful tool, I think, to begin to communicate with others, tell that story about the importance of wood products as it relates to carbon in the forest. And so you need to enter 4 things if you want to use this app. You need to know what forest type you're in. These are basically the FIA forest type groups, and so if you're in the Northeast and you don't see your forest type listed here, I don't know what to tell you, because I think they're all listed here. So choose the one that best matches your forest type. You need to understand, you need to enter some units. Unfortunately or fortunately, foresters don't measure trees in terms of how much carbon they had. If they did, they'd make my life a lot easier. But foresters tend to measure things in terms of board feet, cords, cubic feet, green tons, and so you can select which unit you work with there. And then you need to know where the wood is going. And so what are the wood products that are going to be used for that piece of wood? And so is it hardwood lumber, softwood lumber, plywood, OSB, non-structural panels, or paper and pulp? These wood product classes are based on that Smith report. There are a lot more today. I don't see mass timber here. I don't see wood fiber insulation here. We can do better to add more product classes here, but at least these are the 6 ones that are available for you to choose from. And then you need to enter the volume harvested. So this can be any value. And so you can pretty much enter any value. It could be on a per acre basis. I harvested 25,000 board feet of sugar maple, and I want to know where it goes, how long it's going to be in these various product classes, or you could enter that 800 million cubic feet for the whole entire Northeast, and it should provide you all of that, all those numbers for those different forest products types. So this is one example. Here's a private landowner sells 150 cords of spruce fir from a commercial thinning. So you can select spruce fir there, enter that this is going more probably to paper or pulp. Maybe this is smaller diameter stuff going to a paper or a pulp mill. And you can enter cords of wood as your unit, 150 of them, then press the big blue button, and then you'll get these graphs. And so what you can see is that really steep curve for that product in use. This is all paper or pulp, and so it's going to be a short-lived forest product. A lot of it's going to go to landfill and then begin to decay, and then a lot of it's going to go to the atmosphere pretty quickly. The graph below basically has the bar graph depiction of that with some guidelines there for looking at what's left after for 75%, 50, and 25% that you can see there. The example, I think, when you open the app, this is for a Maple Beach birch hardwood lumber, board feet, and I entered 25,000 board feet in this example. So compare this graph, this is a more durable wood product, hardwood lumber. Compare that to the spruce fir graph, where you see those steep declines for those products in use that you can see there. So that's what I had. That QR code should take you to the Northeast Forest Carbon website where Charlie's put that up, and use it. I think it's a useful way to at least show how long these products are around for, and can begin to convey to people the importance of wood products as we start thinking about placing this in the forest carbon discussion. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Matt. Anybody have any questions? Mike, why don't you speak loudly? That'll be quicker than...
Yeah, definitely important to think about. I mean, I would think about, things like distance to mill are pretty important. So how far is that wood going to go? That's going to be a main driver. Obviously, how much fuel is being consumed by the logging equipment doing the harvesting themselves. That's an important thing. Aside from really trying to quantify that all yourself, a lot of the logger surveys, I know, have some of that kind of information. About how much, I know when I was in Minnesota, we did a really detailed survey about how much fuel do you use on a typical day, how much does the wood move from the woods to the mill. So I would have a look at those logger surveys, because there's some good information about that in those that could help identify some of these questions that you might be after. Yeah, I would say EPA has a lot of that great information. I know I've compiled some of that. I could send you what I have on that information, but EPA has some good information. I would look to there first.
In the back there. Yeah, that's a good point. So kind of like another column looking at tree size and the longevity in the woods. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that was those 10 and 19, those are just kind of average sizes, but
Yeah, could do that. We actually found in that study that it wasn't necessarily that you would think the bigger the log, diameter of the log, the lower it would have to decay. But we actually found that the length of the log matters a lot too. And so if you have a solid intact log that's 60 feet long, that's going to stay around a lot longer than just a large diameter log. So yeah, not just the size diameter-wise, but lengthwise too matters a lot in terms of decay in the woods. A good point, yeah.
Just a note for you, you made a wonderful tool, but we also have the same functionality that's in the FVS harvested carbon reports in something it got adopted by iTree. So it was called Presto, and now it's called iTree Harvest. And it's way easier for people to use than FVS, and it gives you all the same units. It doesn't give you that product mix, it's just pulp saw. But that's another fun thing to play with that you can find on the iTree site.
That's good.
Any other questions for Matt or Chaley for that matter? Great. Well, we're about 5 minutes from the happy hour. So that's it. Thank you all for coming. How about one more round of applause for everybody?
I'm sneaking in here to make one quick announcement. We do have the foresters under 40 from 5 to 6 tonight, as well as the Fems and Forestry from 6 to 7. So feel free to join those. They'll be in the Emerald Ballroom. Foresters under 40-ish. Well.